Hello darlings, welcome back to the Bandit channel. I am Hazel and I am here today to review for you Rivers of London by Ben Aaronovitch. Now I'm actually doing two reviews for this one. One is a very long one which is really a synopsis with my analysis in it, and the other is just my little review bit at the end. This is the short one. Should you want to watch the full version, you can find it on my YouTube channel, and there should be a link to it somewhere or other around the bottom below. Overall, this is really a very strong book, and it's an excellent piece of urban fantasy. I am a huge fan of urban fantasy and have read widely in the genre. To date, this series, with the exception of Kelly Armstrong's wonderful Women of the Other World series, is probably my favourite urban fantasy series. It has some very strong characters in it. Granted, some of the supporting characters are a little bit two-dimensional, but the main characters are excellent. Peter is actually just a breath of fresh air as the main character because he's really not that good at his job. Leslie is the one who's really good at being a copper, and she suffers for it, she really does. Peter, on the other hand, stumbles upon the supernatural and is rewarded really simply for being open to it. Peter is kind of plucked from what would otherwise have been a fairly mediocre existence. We are given a little sort of insight at the beginning of the book into what life would have been like for him, where his career was going before he runs into Nightingale, and it's not what he wanted, and he, doubtless would have found it very boring. So he's kind of taken off that path and thrust into this world where he is immediately not only at the heart of investigating murders, which is what he wanted to do. He always wanted to be a murder detective, but he's also gifted with the world of magic and everything that goes with it. Beyond this, characters are unusual because they take the supernatural in stride. There's no freaking out when they see a ghost. There's no refusal to admit that magic exists. There's no kind of need to try and pretend that cases don't have magical elements to them. As soon as they realise there's anything going on that's even remotely magical, in comes the folly, and that's it, Nightingale deals with it. While the majority of people outside the folly are reluctant to have anything to do with magic, they do acknowledge its existence and the need for someone who does deal with it. They don't like it, but they're fine having somebody around that will do it. So that's really quite unusual and something that I really appreciate. On the whole, the novel breaks a lot of cliches and conventions of this genre. In particular, magic has consequences and magic has limits. These are two things that are very often absent in fantasy, urban fantasy or otherwise, and it's nice to see it worked in from the very start. The consequences of using magic in this series are devastating, both to humans and to the environment that they're in. This gives a really plausible explanation for why people don't just use magic for everything, and that again is something that's often lacking in some stories. And despite my reticence concerning the validity of Peter's scientific knowledge, it's also nice to have the mix of the purely magical approach from Nightingale and the much more modern scientific approach from Peter. The fact that Peter isn't immediately a pro at magic is also a welcome change. He has to work really hard to learn, and he's often lax in this area. In some ways that can be irritating. The reader is left feeling that given the circumstances he really should be more focused, but I actually think it fits more with the character. Peter is not portrayed in any way at all as the kind of highly motivated, highly intelligent person who we often see in the main character role in fantasy fiction. Harry Potter is another example of this that's well done. Harry himself is not exceptionally bright or gifted, although he fares better than Ron. Everybody does. He has to work hard to learn. He doesn't always do things well, and the only thing he's really naturally good at is Quidditch. It's Hermione in the Potterverse, who's the highly motivated, highly intelligent person, and she's the one who provides the answers when the protagonist needs them. And this role is filled by Leslie in Rivers of London, and it works very well for the same reason that Hermione works well in Harry Potter. One person is very rarely all things. So Harry may get up to a lot of heroics, but if you actually analyse the books, you quickly see he would never have succeeded without the aid of his friends. And you can also see that it's often happenstance that places him in the positions that meant he had to take action in the first place. He performs admirably for the most part, but he's not a natural hero in the traditional sense, and neither is Peter, who would not get very far at all without the input of others. Whether it's Leslie or Nightingale, Beverly or Mama or Father Thames, Dr. Wallard, even Tyrone on occasion, he needs input from others to understand what's going on around him. When he's left to his own devices, he tends to cause mayhem. The American title for this novel is Midnight Riot, despite the fact the riot itself is a very small element of a much larger plot and doesn't go on for very long. Peter sets a precedent in this book for future books. The situation leading to the riot escalates when he is robbed of those who can help him. He's cut off from the folly. He can't contact Molly. Nightingale is out of commission. Leslie is caught up in the action itself and can't help him. He's completely on his own. The result is a riot and the streets of London burning. Literally. This is what happens when he tries to deal with things alone. And this, in an odd way, is why he's so lovable. We can forgive him his flaws, and we can forgive him his inexplicable knowledge, and we can forgive him his laziness and his penchant for reading historical plaques, because when it comes down to it, he gets the job done, and he does it in a really entertaining way. That is what Peter Grant is. He's just entertainment. He's funny throughout the whole novel, with a level of dry British humour and wit that is really a joy to read, and very refreshing considering how many books in this genre are American. I really do appreciate the fact that this one is British. There are some horrific events in this book, and yet the book itself is hilariously funny to read. At the same time, the humour doesn't take over the whole book. This is a piece of urban fantasy. It's not comic fantasy. It just so happens to be bloody funny. It's also detailed, it's imaginative, and includes some really unique mythology that is a nice change of pace. But please don't think I'm going to do nothing but gush over this. While the book is very entertaining and extremely well written, it's not without its flaws. Although the setting and the transformation of London into a character in its own right is really nicely done, there are numerous instances throughout the book where I felt it was just overdone. Now, I'm a northern lass. You can probably tell from my voice. I have no truck with London. I'm sorry if you're a Londoner, but it's just not a place for me. In the 6 years since I have returned from down south, where I was living for work for a short period, I have been back to London 3 times. Once to go to the Globe Theatre, once to meet a literary agent, and once to go and see Robin Hobb and George R.R. Martin. They were the only things that could compel me to return to London. And that's just, that's not because I don't like cities. I love Manchester. I'm just not a Londoner. And I think if you're not a Londoner, having the overwhelm of London is a bit like, oh, enough already. A lot of it was interesting, the history was interesting, a lot of it was stuff that I didn't know, and that was good, but you don't really need to know which street he's walking down and which street he's crossing over onto and which road he's going down, and it's just like, it's just an overload. It was just excessive. Also, if you're not actually from London and you've never been there, it can get quite confusing. I have been to London on quite a few occasions, and even I found it confusing. So it's just a surplus of information that isn't needed, and it negates all that wonderful work Aaronovitch has done in weaving the really large quantities of information about the Metropolitan Police Department into the narrative. And I find that odd that he can get so much info dump into the narrative in such a beautiful way, and yet then kind of ruin it slightly with all of this extra London description. While it's an entertaining read, it's not life-altering. There was no deeper meaning to the book. It's just entertainment. And while there's nothing wrong with this, a lot of people just read for entertainment, they want to escape, it left me wanting just a little bit more. Another issue is the use of two plots. There's the murder investigation going on, and there's the situation with the rivers, and these are happening in tandem, and it's not until the very, very end that they interact, and they only interact in a very brief manner. This leaves the reader kind of bouncing back and forth between the two with no real focus. Added to this were some additional red herrings, such as the investigation of the vampires, which added absolutely nothing to anything and just slowed everything down. And there was a general lag in the middle of the book where there wasn't really anything going on and it was all moving very slowly. What kept you reading at that point was the quality of the writing and the wit, not the plot. I've mentioned Peter's flaws as a good thing, but they can also get quite annoying. He forgets things very quickly, which means the reader is told the same thing over and over again sometimes. While his forgetfulness is quite an endearing personality trait, the repetitiveness is not welcome. Likewise, Peter is capable of making huge leaps in logic without any real evidence to speak of. And in particular, the crucial points in the plot where Peter realises first who the villain really is, and shortly afterwards how they found out about a particularly important piece of information. These two revelations really do come out of thin air. There's just nothing there that would give him that kind of conclusion. I mean, he's demonstrated repeatedly that he doesn't have Leslie's level of analytical thinking and the kind of keen police mind, shall we say, that she has. So for him to kind of come to these conclusions without anything to base them on, it just doesn't quite work. We've seen he just doesn't do well on his own. He relies on other people for information. So having him come to these conclusions on his own it's a real stretch, especially as we've seen. He relies on other people informing his thoughts. So it's not only a big leap in logic for him, it's a big leap in logic that he made completely alone, and that just doesn't fit with the rest of his character. So there you have it, darlings. That is my wonderful review of the wonderful Rivers of London. I shall be back next week to do another review on book 2, which is Moon Over Soho. If you like the video, do please share it on Facebook or wherever else you might happen to be, and don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss the next instalment. Bye! And he screws up, like, a lot. The only point about Peter's character that I really dislike is the need to explain how he knows so much about London's history, and the fact that there's no real explanation given for where all of his scientific knowledge comes from. It's like, on the one hand, you've got way too much explanation of how he knows stuff, and on the other hand, he knows way too much and there's no explanation for it. Certainly, there is nothing in his background or habits that suggests anything that would explain such knowledge. Peter, meanwhile, has concluded that someone must have warned Pike about their plan, which is how he ended up heading them off and shooting Nightingale. This is an uncomfortable conclusion because there are only a few people who knew about it, and they're all police officers. And started getting younger again. And so he appears currently to be a roughly middle-aged man, when in fact he's, I think, at least like 90, 100, something like that. Yeah, he's not one of the guys off the Big Bang Theory, okay? It just doesn't quite work. So on the one hand, it's good that he has this kind of analytical mind and tries to find the answers to explain magic in a scientific way. But on the other, it detracts from the believability of the character, in my opinion, because it just doesn't make sense that he knows all of this stuff and that he would think in this way. So, despite the fact that he doesn't really have any background in science whatsoever, Peter somehow manages to come to the conclusion that magic is a lot like the laws of thermodynamics. So casting spells requires power, and if you cast a spell, power is kind of sucked from something nearby. This is similar to what happens to humans who use too much magic, in that it eventually drains all of the energy out of them if they don't limit their use and allow themselves to kind of have time to recuperate. They kind of suck the energy out of themselves, and this is how you end up with cabbage brain. It's a lovely thought, isn't it? Cabbage brain, magical sucking. Ooh, dear me. So Peter and Leslie continue to investigate this, while Nightingale takes Peter to visit Father Thames upriver. This is all an attempt to broker a peace between him and Mama Thames, as it would seem that there's some kind of dispute going on as to who presides over which part of the river. Peter's self-deprecating humour, his constant quips, his banter with Leslie, and to a slightly lesser extent Nightingale, often make it seem like this is just kind of a fun jaunt through London. And this scene really kind of grounds the reader again and reminds them, actually no, this started with a murder, like a fairly horrific murder, and that is what the book's about. You know, they are police officers, they work in London, and London is not the best place to work in when you're a police officer. It's really quite hard. So I think, you know, he needed that to just remind people that there were serious issues going on, as well as all the light-hearted humour and the funny stuff. So that's good. Very, very well done. Peter is able to prevent Coopertown from escaping, but the man actually dies before they can do anything with him. He rants incoherently and then just kind of collapses and dies. His face, oddly, just kind of collapses in on itself, like falls off or something. It's really very odd. And Nightingale tells him that this has been caused by a spell of some description, which alters a person's facial features and makes them look different. This explains how the ghost could have seen him change his face and then kill the guy, because he did literally make his face look different and then kill the guy. So that's how he did it and why his face is collapsed. But the thing they can't figure out is why on earth anybody would cast this spell knowing that it would, one, kill them, and two, make their face fall off. So it doesn't really make much sense. So the autopsy is conducted by Nightingale's magic doctor, by which I mean a doctor who is aware of magic and specialises in treating people who have been afflicted by magic. He's not actually magical. He's Dr. Wallid, and he becomes a recurring character throughout the series and kind of their go-to person for anything when it connects to medicine. And he shows them Coopertown's brain, which is kind of cabbaged, and that becomes a sort of a coined term by Peter for describing what happens to somebody's brain when they've used too much magic. It kind of ends up looking like a cabbage. So, with the fun thought in mind that his brain could become cabbaged if he uses too much magic, Peter carries on learning to use magic. He starts by learning about magical residue, which is called vestigium, and it's what's left behind when people cast spells or when anything kind of magical happens. He also learns to cast his own spells, or begins to at least, with starting with a really simple one, which is like a little light. It's called a wear light. It's just like a little glowing ball of light. And he and Nightingale are called in to investigate other cases as they go, all of them involving the supernatural in one way or another. One of them is the result of rivalry between the river gods, and Peter discovers that the rivers all have spirits, and this is of course where the book gets its name, the Rivers of London. The other case is about a family who were apparently killed by vampires. Until they conclude that somebody must have cast the spell on him rather than him being an actual practitioner of magic.